Hello, thanks for joining me again for the Weatherquest farming forecast. There's been lots of weather around recently and we've heard all sorts of stories of severe wet weather, extreme droughts, and this next 3 to 4 week period I think is going to be somewhat kinder to us, but it is still fairly complex. So let's first of all start by having a look at conditions worldwide, see what we can say about those. Well, in the States there have been some widespread fairly heavy showers across the eastern third of the country and below average temperatures through the Corn Belt, so that's given them some better conditions for corn and soybeans. And moving across the border into Canada, well, here they've had dry, warm and sunny weather, so that's been good for their harvest conditions and the development of the spring grains. So things are going along and progressing nicely there. Going south into South America and Brazil, the dry weather there has favoured the harvest for those folk. And for Europe, it does look as though we've had all of the extremes going on. I'm sure it hasn't been exceptional in the sense that other parts of the world have had extreme weather, but for us it's made the news bulletins. So we've had extreme heat stress, record-breaking temperatures, and not just in the UK but also across much of Central and Western Europe. And the conditions generally have been fairly good in the southeastern corner of Europe. So the grain growing areas of Western Russia, southwestern Russia, the Ukraine and so on have generally fared better. So plenty of contrasts across the continent. If you look at how the maximum temperatures have been analysed by the Dutch Meteorological Institute, KNMI, they've produced a plot here which is very interesting. It shows the highest maximum temperatures recorded during this year, and you can see that the UK does come into that category of very extreme heat, but the main partition for the hottest weather has been over northeastern France and the Low Countries, some other hot spots showing up here. But there's one thing which for me as a meteorologist looks slightly less commonplace, and that is this band of very hot weather across northern Scandinavia and particularly down the western coast of Norway. Now, it's not often you get coastal regions getting extreme temperatures like that, especially those that face the flow in from the Atlantic. So it just reaffirms the notion that we've had a period of weather which has seen high pressure bringing air up from the continent as a southeasterly. So this part of Scandinavia has been much hotter than usual. So let's have a look now at one other feature closer to home that's worth a mention. I know we've seen lots of stories in the news very recently about extreme rainfall events, but overall, in general, we're getting signals that the south of the country is experiencing drier weather, and some of the rivers, the River Test, for example, the chalk rivers down in the south of the country, it may be a case of drought permits being needed, and that may enable people to be granted temporary hosepipe bans, the water authorities that is. So that's something to bear in mind if you're involved in irrigation of crops and so on. So it's a case of looking to see for rainfall. Well, rainfall is something which has been a feature recently, as I've said, but this is a particularly attractive way of looking at it when you can look at a sequence of radar images, and it shows very clearly some pressure systems are quite complex. It's not just like a weather front moving from west to east across the country. So that would be a band of rain. Sometimes you get the actual centre of the low pressure moving across. In the summer months, these can be quite complex affairs with lots of separate bands of rain spiralling around, and you can even get fine weather close to the centre of the low itself. So this is how we started this recent spell of wet weather. You can see the circulation around the centre of the low, a lot of thundery weather to the north of it where we still had the residual very warm unstable air from our heat wave, and some areas just sat underneath very wet weather for quite long periods of time, and you can see how there's been a tendency for the rain to form in bands as well, affecting one part of the country, particularly the northwest, quite badly recently with some very severe weather up there. Now the low itself just drifted off to the east now, and it is eventually going to move southeast. So just when you think you've got your mind set on a direction for these things, they can change and they can go in a totally different direction. So what's left of that low is kind of moving away now. So we're over the worst of it, but it has changed things in terms of how much moisture there is in the ground. There's no need to tell you, you've got a lot of moisture in the ground in northern Britain. But until very recently, this whole map was filled with soil moisture deficit readings from the Cosmos system, which showed drier than average conditions in the soil, so quite large soil moisture deficits building up. But here the blue colours suggest that some of these northern areas, after their recent very heavy rain, have now reached field capacity. So they're starting to come back to waterlogged ground in many areas. Now, that's not going to last, but if you want to keep a track on where the storms are moving at any one time, the WQRadar system is really useful. It gives you 5-minute updates for the radar image. It also will allow you to overlay actual observations, so you can get a measure of how much rain has actually fallen from a given storm. You can also use it to get prolonged periods of rainfall, add up the totals if you like for a day or 12 hours or whatever. And not only that, it will send you an alert when lightning is detected nearby, which can be very useful from a health and safety point of view for outdoor events and so on. If you want to find out more for this, then WQRadar.co.uk is the place to go to on the web, and that will enable you to find out how to subscribe and so on. Very useful thing. I use it myself, wouldn't be without it. Anyway, let's press on to the week in hand, because you'll be able to use your radar displays for that. I'm hiding up the jet stream because what we're showing here now is that there isn't much jet stream activity over the UK. So the systems themselves are quite weak. Now, when we say systems are quite weak, weather system driven by jet streams, this is lows we're talking about, the large-scale features of the atmosphere. That doesn't stop this sort of atmosphere, where there are no jet streams, producing some locally quite heavy showers. But if I set the sequence going during the next few days, which will take us through the weekend and up to the middle of next week, you can see a jet stream does indeed appear, and it moves in across the south of the country, northern France. And while the strength of the jet stream not necessarily all that strong, summertime jet streams are much weaker than the winter, and the lows therefore are less developed. The fact that it's this far south is not really a summer typical pattern. It normally would be much farther north. So it means some unsettled weather, but it also puts us on the northern side of it, or much of the country, which tends to suggest a flavour towards showery type of weather rather than many hours of rain from weather fronts. So let's see what the pressure pattern looks like. Well, actually, I'm hiding the important bit. Here it is. It's an area of low pressure, and that is the key feature that's going to develop. And, well, I say develop. It's going to move towards us. It may not develop that much. It's already an old, well-established feature. So as we run the sequence, you'll see it produces some showery rain, some longer spells of rain coming into Ireland, the western side of the UK. There will be fronts involved, but what happens in the summer as they come eastwards, they tend to break up and the rain becomes fragmented into some showery areas of weather. And you can see they're still moving around, and the low, there it is. It's now reached Ireland, so it's come from behind me. As far as Western Ireland, it still hasn't got right over the country. I'm sure this may well drift across as we go into the second half of next week. So all in all, it's an unsettled pattern of weather, but in a summertime sense. There will be rain, so it's going to be tricky times for the harvest folk, because you're going to be stopping and starting because of these showers coming through. But the good news is none of them, these areas of rain, stay in any one place for a huge length of time. So the chances are you'll be able to get out again and start working. So let's have a look at how this looks for the next 10 days or so. And looking all through next week, this upper graph is rainfall. Lots of spiky stuff going on here from those fronts and the individual showers. And depending on which run of the model you look at, this, if I can just remind you, is an ensemble forecast collection. So it's a collection of forecasts, and each one will give a slightly different answer because it has slightly different starting conditions. They're all quite possible to happen, so you could get a lot of rain in any one place from a shower if it's right over you, or if it's not, then the numbers will be a bit lower and it'll be down here. So this variability, typical of showery weather with fronts and troughs coming through. So that's after the weekend. So this is what the model thinks will happen as we go into next week from Monday through to Friday. So next week, very changeable because of that sequence of weather you saw with the low moving in. After that, it's a little bit more open-minded about things, doesn't quite know which way to play it, but there are two periods which look interesting, shall we say. This one has got quite a few members of it that produce a wet spell of weather next weekend. That's Sunday the 11th, Saturday into Sunday So the following weekend does look as if it could turn out to be wet. The next period is a middle part of the week when there's one, what we call an outlier. One of the runs has produced a very extreme wet day there. So these are all things to be looking out for, but they're some way away. They're in the middle of the following week, so we don't have to concern ourselves just yet. In terms of the atmospheric pressure, if you're going to get rain, it's going to be unsettled. And here you can see, well, slight fluctuations in the pressure, nothing extreme, no really deep lows. On the other hand, there are no really big highs either. And the other thing about this bit of the chart, up to the end of the weekend, you can see these lines, they're all pretty much on top of each other. So the model, they're all in agreement, all the different runs of the ensemble, they're all fairly happy with things up to the end of the weekend. And then there's a bit more variability in here. But the real step change to much more uncertainty comes as we go through this sequence of undulating, slightly higher, slightly lower pressure, probably from weak systems coming across the Atlantic. The other thing we can look at is what that means in terms of water gain or loss. And at this time of the year, the typical evaporation rates, you can get rid of a lot of water just on a fine day, about 3 millimetres of water a day. So this shows that overall for the next 10 days, we're going to be running with a deficit. So you end up being drier than it is at the moment at the start here. Now, one or two of these model runs of this ensemble, this collection of forecasts, will take us into the wetter than we are now position. This is an example for East Anglia, but other examples from other parts of the country may have a slightly different bias. You could imagine, for example, in the west of Britain, closer to that low, there'd be a lot of these runs would be up here on the wetter than average bit. So anyway, here we go. So we've got this sequence that suggests slightly drier than average by about 5 to 10 millimetres. Nowhere does it go much beyond that. So that gives you an idea for the middle course to follow of up to about 10 millimetres deficit during the next 10 days. If you go to the extreme dry end of these ensembles, you could be something like 20, 25 millimetres down. So it gives you a scale of what the problems might be if you're trying to irrigate crops, potatoes for example. So let's have a look and see how we're doing temperature-wise. This is week 1, so a bit of detail at the beginning here. Very obviously true where the cold weather is. Really cold air, unusually so, over Russia, gets into parts of Eastern Europe. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be wet, but certainly cooler than average. Still some warmer than average weather over southern Scandinavia, and just a little bit of warmer than average weather left over northern Scotland. Elsewhere, much of a muchness. The white colours suggest average temperatures, and some very hot air just parked down there over North Africa. So if we were to get strong southerly winds again, we know what we'll be talking about with that. The other thing is that on the Portugal part of the Iberian Peninsula, there is slightly colder than average conditions there, probably some fronts and some weather coming in from the Atlantic. So in terms of the jet stream, how's that controlling things? Well, we saw from the chart earlier on that the jet stream position is a bit farther south than you'd normally expect it to be at this time of the year. So instead of being up here over the north of the country, it's down to the south. Well, it does mean that we're going to see systems being pushed towards us, and on the northern side of the jet stream where we are, probably the balance will be more towards a showery type of weather once the fronts themselves have gone through. So the rainfall anomaly, the precipitation, you can see a band of rain where the front becomes slow moving over the middle of Europe and systems move through, but actually some dry weather through France and some dry weather for much of northern Europe and Scandinavia. We're close to normal, but just the hint, these colours here, just the hint of going on to the wetter than average side of things, possibly showery weather. As I said, we're on that northern side of the jet stream where showers are more likely. Now, going into week 2, the jet stream is still there, slightly stronger in fact. It just feels as if it's quite a significant feature. So we could have rather more activity going across the south of the country in particular. And you can see we've increased the amount of precipitation. So the precipitation anomaly, how much wetter than average it is, that is showing up in darker colours now. So it looks as though week 2 is going to be wetter than probably many of you would want for your harvest, I'm afraid. And particularly so looking down here towards western parts of Spain and Portugal. That looks some very wet weather, but dry in the southeast of Spain. And the wet weather extends into Central and Eastern Europe too. So thinking about how the harvest conditions are going there, I suspect they're already well through things in most places, but there is going to be some wetter weather turning up there as well. Moving on to the temperature pattern, we've gone white, which pretty much means we're about average. So there's not much to say about that. And in fact, even the intensity of the cooler weather over Russia has relinquished its grip a bit. Still some warmish air through the Mediterranean, and still slightly cooler, I suspect, because of cloudier conditions over Portugal down here. Right, looking at week 3, a quick statement about the precipitation side of things. The activity of the jet moved all its rainfall events into Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, and it looks as though this northern half through the middle here, not quite so wet, but even southern Scandinavia and the Low Countries starting to get a look at some of this slightly above average rainfall. It's a small signal for slightly above average rainfall. Doesn't necessarily mean horrendous amounts of rain, but it is just saying no sign of a dry, hot spell of weather in there. And in fact, as we look into the 4th week, the precipitation anomaly pattern suggests that the dry weather is still on the continent, and we are in this sort of just slightly on the wetter side of average, but only slightly so. So there we are then. Let's try and summarise that for you. There's a lot of interesting things happening in the weather at the moment, but some things just fall out into place. And although we had that warmer than average spell of weather assigned to northwestern Scotland, that corner of the country at the beginning, I think it is just at first. Otherwise, near or slightly above average for the temperatures would be a sufficient statement for the country. I think showers or longer spells of rain over the weekend running into next week, and that's going to make harvesting conditions very difficult to predict. So it's a check the forecast from day to day sort of story. And generally wetter than average throughout August. Well, I say that, but it is with a sense of caution about it, because it's only slightly wetter than average, and I'm sure you will get some drier intervals in there. It's just going to make your work, I think, a bit more challenging. So there we are. That's your forecast for the next 3 to 4 weeks. If you want to find out any more information or send us some commentary on how your farming is going this year, then do get in touch with us at info@weatherquest.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you and how you're getting on with the farm tasks and what sort of features you might, for example, want to see in the forecast. We're always happy to add new things in if they'll be of interest. And you can follow us on Twitter, of course. That's WQ Farming Forecast. Look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for watching.